welcome tonight, and I think you're going to find this evening to be yet another important time in our exploration of transit choices and the tools that we can use in promoting those conversations. But there are several things that have happened recently that I think I would like to just mention. Several of us were just talking about this. Mayor Dean made an announcement yesterday, which I'm sure all of you have seen or read, about the AMP project, basically doing two things. One, saying on a couple of segments of the corridor, the engineering team had been instructed to look at how that corridor would perform if it didn't have the dedicated lanes down the middle of the road. And the areas in question, from I-440 all the way west to St. Thomas, was the longest stretch. And then that short stretch between the I-40 bridge downtown right there at Beeman and what used to be Jim Reed, out to several blocks out there to 18th, 19th, or 18th, where Broadway and West End split. I felt the mayor's comments were right on target. They were very accurate. The thing that I think, though, it's important for us to know, the engineers, when they laid out the first phase analysis of that corridor and talked about placing dedicated lanes in as much of it as possible, didn't develop at that stage and weren't supposed to develop at that stage, the 30% design stage, the detailed information on what the performance characteristics of a dedicated lane along different parts of the corridor would be, performance including ridership as well as speed, in comparison with the cost of adding those dedicated lanes and the possible traffic complications. And of course, right out of the box, the opponents, a number of the opponents of the project got onto that issue and said, you're really going to make a mess out of traffic on the western end of the corridor. I mean, we've all talked about that. And what was missing at that point was an analysis that said, well, it's worth it, number one. Number two, it won't screw it up as badly as you might think it would. That information simply was not developed at that point in time. And so one argument would have been that the mayor and the team might have opened that issue up earlier in the process and said, well, we're all going to look at it together. And then we'll decide if, in fact, the dedicated lane on that segment is really an absolute feature that we must have of this project. That didn't happen until yesterday. And, of course, the timing is kind of interesting yesterday because there is this possibility of legislative action in the General Assembly that actually, if the Senate bill were to pass, as we talked about last time, if that Senate bill were to pass, it would stop the project because it would make it a violation of state law to do what, if the dedicated lanes were on a state route. So, of course, you know the reaction from yesterday has been, well, the mayor did it because he's trying to weaken the opposition so we can get through that legislative process. Well, there's some truth to that. But the more important truth, I think, is that the process, and it's a tribute to the engineers and the designers, at this point, the process ought to feature their work to see what can be done as much as possible in that corridor, and then make a decision. And then the second thing is to create a citizen advisory committee. I've talked with Lydia. One of the things that Governor Bredesen did when we first came in 2002, 2003, was we identified 15 very controversial projects all over the state of Tennessee that were gridlocked over citizen opposition and legal opposition. Even the Southern Environmental Law Center was involved on. The one here closest to us was State Route 840 in Williamson County. And the first thing that we did, the governor directed, commissioner, and we put the teams together, were to create citizen advisory committees for each one of those 15 projects. And we invited opponents, supporters, middle people. We invited the whole group, and it's exactly what Carl Dean did yesterday on the AMP project. Exactly what he did is to create that. And so there was we've had a lot of interest in doing that. He's done it. So I think that's good news. So that's sort of the background. If we have some time as we get on into our agenda, we can talk more about it. My take on this clearly is this: I'm glad that this is happening. We have no business forcing a public project like dedicated lanes on BRT if they're not valued, if they won't perform the way they're supposed to. Then we ought not to pursue that. That's just a matter of good public policy sense to know that the benefits are worth the cost that we're having to pay. And then the public involvement piece is okay. Very important and very okay. Second thing, just briefly, and Greg spent more time, and you'll get to hear from Greg a little bit more, obviously, tonight. But Rob Romasco is the president of AARP nationally, and was in town today, and a small group of us were invited to have breakfast with him this morning. And I have to say, I was very impressed as they're trying to marshal the resources of that large organization, and you know AARP is very large, to stay in front of this incredible swell of people moving into the age groups from 50, 55 on. The numbers are just overwhelming. We've talked about them. But transit is very much a part of the world that they're dealing with. Housing policy, hunger, food policy, land use policies in general, and then accessibility, including transportation choices, are a part of a very complex agenda. And the saddest part of the morning for me was Rob talking about the incapacity of Congress to truly wrestle with those issues because of the political dynamics at the present time. And they're a nonpartisan organization. They're very nonpartisan. And the particular question I'd asked him was regarding the transportation bill and whether or not something is going to move forward to give us a new transportation bill. And he said he was not optimistic at all. And that's a really frightening scenario. And so on. But he was here today, and Greg may, if we have time, may want to spend a little bit more time. But I was very impressed with him. Those people are key people that lead those large organizations that represent so many people on a national scale. And it was an honor to spend some time with him. Final thing I'll say was, and I will get the link out to you, the Smart Growth America this morning released the second sprawl report. They did the first sprawl report in 2002. It's a very sophisticated analysis led by the School of Urban Studies at the University of Utah in Salt Lake City. The report, as you would imagine, scored Nashville and Middle Tennessee very low. In fact, and Clarksville was even lower in terms of the measurements that they use of interconnected roadways, density of development, density of land use types. It's a really fascinating approach. Kelly probably knows it by memory, but it's a great tool. And as you can imagine, New York and Manhattan at the top, San Francisco right under in terms of absence of sprawl and health benefits and the well-being benefits, the economic development benefits that come from that form of development. So we've got work to do. I was honored today because Ken Moore, the mayor of Franklin, was on the panel on the national webinar that SGA put together, had 5 respondents, and one was Mayor Moore from Franklin. And they did select an area that was low on the ranking, and to talk about what we're doing and the work that Franklin's doing was mentioned. And then Ralph Schultz was on from the chamber here in Nashville, and he talked about it. And then the other 3 persons were from cities that ranked much higher. So we'll send you the link. Take a look at it. It's a fascinating exercise in analysis of land use and transportation structure and form. The only other comment I'd make, and then I'll introduce Greg, is a disturbing part of that, if you read it, you'll see it, and we're hearing a lot of conversation about it, is upward mobility is directly correlated with density and spatial connectedness. Really frightening. And the example that was used is, a young, and race is really not even a factor. It works right across the board. A young boy or young girl from a relatively sprawling area has far less chance to obtain economic growth and development measured by such things as finishing high school, finishing college, getting jobs, salary, those kind of things, than somebody that's grown up in that dense environment. It makes you think. The analysis is correlational, so there'll be a lot of social and discussion about what makes it work that way, but the evidence is pretty clear. So in this big national and really worldwide discussion we're having right now about, have we reached the end of the time, certainly in this country, when that kind of mobility is something anybody can reach for, this would be a piece in that puzzle of conversation. Rob, I don't know, Greg, if Rob had some good things to say about his own career development and how that mobility that he had as a young boy whose parents didn't finish high school, and here he is, a PhD and a head of a large organization, was enabled by these connections that our environment allows us to have. Okay, so with those three things in mind, let's move to the program. We've talked about from the beginning the need to look at transit choices. We've talked about resources that are already available and did our field trip. And then last week we had a wonderful tour through the vision of where we must go, if I could paraphrase Michael Skipper. But we talked about that vision and what work that the MPO has done and is doing to help define options and the need to have those options in place fairly soon as our demographics demonstrated the needs that we will have. So we shift now, and this is getting closer to your project time, but we shift now in a way to say, okay, what are those tools that we can use as community leaders, as influential people, and each of you is. Is that right? Is, are? Anyway. Yeah, okay, well, I'm not influential, that's for sure. But anyway, as we have this task, what are those tools that we can use? And we have tonight really the opportunity to hear two people that I think you'll find very fascinating with insights. Greg Bailey is a long experienced public relations and communications expert here in Nashville. For many years headed up Ketchervon and Bailey Public Relations, now is the base of Bailey Communications. Some of us that have been around a while remember reading Greg's columns in the Banner back in the good days, one of the best columnists around at that time. And he transitioned from journalism into the communications area. So Greg is going to talk to us about our communication techniques and tools and the task. He's familiar with what we're doing. He's been involved with the Transit Alliance and was involved in the early phases of the AMP project during the preliminary engineering phase of the work. So this is not foreign territory. This is not something academic to Greg. He's very much in the midst of it. And then I'll introduce Linda, who will follow when Greg is finished, because we have a treat, really a treat in store to hear Linda Peak-Shack, and then she follows the second part of our evening. So Greg, without further ado, you're on.
Thanks,
and he loves music, by the way, and concert, any group, ask him.
Thanks.
You're welcome.
Appreciate it. Going to see Springsteen in Cincinnati next Tuesday night. Kicks off the U.S. Tour. When does the bus leave? I'm not sure when my bus is leaving. Thank you. I think this is the third time I've spoken to this group, and it's always a pleasure to be in the same room with leaders from Middle Tennessee. Let me just take a quick survey. How many of you have been through the Leadership Middle Tennessee program? Okay, great. How many of you have been through leadership programs in your own cities, counties, etc.? Most of you. Okay, well, great. That's good to know. We're going to talk about creating conversations related to transit. And I'm not going to talk a lot about transit today, because you're getting transit ad nauseum. You probably know now as much about transit as I do. But we're going to talk about conversations and how it relates to talking about transit, because it's not a difficult topic, especially for those of you who've had to inch your way in and out of Nashville in the recent weeks, or unless you live here and are up to your amp in the amp. And that'll be the last reference that I'll make about that project. But you know, how do you create the conversations that are out there today when you are overcome with chatter and talk? And as Harry Nilsson said of the song, everybody's talking at me. The truth is, I don't hear a word they're saying, and they don't hear you either. More than ever before, it feels like there's so much chatter, so much talk. And so how do we create meaningful conversations that lead to action? And that's what I really want to spend some time talking with you today. But, you know, the question is, who really does talk anymore? Look at these things. How many? I mean, we all do this. We all are in Facebook, and we're in Twitter, and we're on LinkedIn, and we're on, you know, whatever. And so the conversation has changed, or the medium for the conversation has changed. You know, no longer are there that many face-to-face conversations. I met two people today that I've been working with for 5 or more years. met them face-to-face today for the first time. But I've emailed, I've telephoned, never sat down and had a conversation with them before. And so the conversations today is more technological. Okay, I'm going to admit this. I have 2 college-age children, and we text back and forth in my own house. So in my office is in the lower level in the basement of my house, and my daughter, who's about to graduate from Belmont, is on the top floor. And she texts me, "Has the dog had lunch?" She doesn't. So look at how our conversation patterns have changed. So conversations are also happening quicker and at the same time. So at the same time that she's texting me about the dog, I'm talking to a client via email. Somebody has tweeted something that I've talked about. Somebody's on Facebook wanting to send me a message. So it's really a combination of this ongoing, just mass amount of talk and chatter that we're faced with. But today, we have to start a serious conversation about transit, or transit reform, because cars don't cut it anymore. We're not going to be able to move from point A to point B to point C in this region over the next 30 years if we don't do something about transit. And the key to the conversation is that you want someone to understand and adopt what you're telling them. My job in a public relations world is I try to change your behavior. I may work for AARP, which I do, by the way, and do work for them. And so what we're talking about is livable communities. If you've heard that phrase, and I'm sure he brought that phrase up this morning, livable communities are walkable communities. There's communities that are transit-friendly communities. It's not only just curb cuts on the sidewalk, but it's smart streets and designing neighborhoods and housing that's single stories and meets the community's needs. So, but the real key is to getting you to understand what I'm trying to, quote, sell you or change your behavior is listening. So we're going to talk about listening today. Because I think once you understand how listening works, then it's going to help you frame the message that you're trying to deliver. I love this quote. I've used this quote a bunch through the years. Everybody knows this book. This was by, the number 1 business book of the 20th century was The 7 Habits. And so I want you to look at that quote and think about conversations that you've had today. Did someone talk over the top of you? 50% chance or better that they probably did. Were you interrupted by somebody who's just got to tell you something? Just got to tell you something. You're trying to get your point across in the conversation, but you can't. Because if you look at the last sentence there, most people listen with the intent to reply, not to understand. They're too busy wanting to reply to what you say than to listen to what's being said to you. I told somebody, I was in a meeting next door, and I said, the most important part of what I do is listening. I mean, I can write, and I've been able to write, and was in the newspaper business when I was younger, and so I learned how to write, and I went to college and, took journalism classes, so I kind of learned how to write. But what it's taken me all this time to do is to really learn how to listen. So, let's see here. Yeah, here we go. Habit number 5 in the 7 habits is about listening. Seek first to understand, then to be understood. Dr. Covey says that we filter everything we hear through our own life experiences. So our own frame of reference sets up what we hear. And then by checking what you hear through your autobiography, you decide way in advance what the other person means before they ever finish talking to you. So when you think about it, it's hard to believe that any business deal gets done. How does that happen? Because you're either waiting to respond to somebody or you've already filtered through your autobiography what this person is trying to propose to you, but boy, you can certainly see where the divorce rate keeps rising because we're not listening. So I want to delve a little deeper here. Here are four ways that you listen. You evaluate, you probe, you advise, and you interpret. Because we listen autobiographically, we tend to respond in one of these following ways. Think about how you react in a conversation. Sometimes what they may want you to know isn't what they're asking, if that makes any sense. Very often they're really making a statement in their question. Here's an example. You're in a conversation with somebody in your community and they say, well, why do you want to raise our taxes for transit that nobody is going to ride? Well, now, they've already made up their mind. So it's case closed. If someone in the media asks that question, what we do in public relations is we work with clients to flip that back. We never repeat the negative. What we do is we call that kind of bridging. Say, well, we haven't even talked about taxes here. This is not an issue of taxes. This is an issue about transit need. Or why would I want to ride a bus to work every day? Well, in their mind, even though they might speed you down the, well, we don't know now. When I started putting this together, it was still center lane, so who knows anymore. Anyway, but think about center lanes, okay? It speeds you faster than you're going to go in your car. But riding a bus every day to work, the individual's opinion is that mass transit isn't for them. They're not willing to look at the bigger picture, which is what you all are doing here, of how mass transit is going to affect our community, our region over the next 40 years. So as advocates for transit, we need your voice to be heard in the conversation. In fact, we need you to start the conversation. Because in too many communities in this region, there is no conversation. And if we don't start that conversation now and begin to arm you with the talking points and the opportunity to tell the story of transit, then we're all going to be sitting out there on asphalt, frankly, for the rest of our lives. So I want to share with you some listening skills. And I think these are important only from the standpoint of it'll help you in your everyday life. I found that it actually helped me with my children who don't listen to a darn thing I ever say, but I've kind of gotten used to that. So this is what happens. This is some things that I think that can be helpful to you. Are there any auditors in the room? Anybody do audits? Believe it or not, I stole these tips from a magazine for auditors called Internal Auditor. And I have no idea why they were getting into this one day, but here's some things to think about. Most of us speak about 175 words a minute. 175 words a minute. My wife can do 2.25 just like that. Research shows us that we're capable, though, of listening and processing 600 to 1,000 words a minute. So we're not hearing as much as we could process. Experts say nonverbal messages may be 3 times as powerful as verbal messages. So your takeaway from this presentation may not be a darn thing that I've said or will say, but what may be on those pieces of paper may very well have an impact upon you. Show people that you're listening, maintaining eye contact, you're leaning forward, you're not twirling something in your hand, you're not sitting in the back of the room on your phone, which, there are days that I will admit to doing that. But because we listen at a faster rate than people think, we have a tendency to evaluate too quickly. So again, we're really not listening, we're preparing to respond. We're evaluating what you're telling me. So in a communications world, we have to continue to listen to the feedback that we get. Here's some more tips that'll improve listening skills. Avoid getting defensive. There's too much time spent explaining, elaborating, and defending your position is a sure sign that you're really not listening. Well, we could role play this about any number of topics. Think about politics. If you're too busy explaining or defending your position, then you're not even listening to my position. Paraphrasing is an art. It's putting your own words, what you thought you heard, and sending them back to a sender. It's good for conversations. It's really bad for presentations when somebody says, somebody stands up at a public meeting and says, well, I'm not paying more taxes for mass transit. Well, the last thing you want to do, again, is to repeat that and say, well, no, we're not talking about raising your taxes. But the truth of the matter is, and if you don't know this by now, we're going to have to pay for mass transit. But how do we do that? We're going to get to that. We're going to talk about that. So I wanted to just give you just a little of those listening skills and hope that they might help you, but they're also that as you begin to start to talk about this and go out and advocate for transit, there are a lot of brick walls in front of you. There's a bunch of people. So how do we talk about it? I mean, how do we carry on a conversation about mass transit in Middle Tennessee today that is intelligent conversation, that leads to the end game? And I think Michael Skipper showed you what the end game, and I have less slides than Michael, by the way, which he's like the king of slides. But what we're trying to do is get to a point to where what he showed you becomes a reality. And so you have to know your messages, and you've got to already listen, and none of us want to sound like robots, so we have to incorporate the message. I've never been to the graduation ceremony for this event, but it's sort of like getting an Eagle Scout thing. I mean, at this point, you got to be prepared for everything. You got to become transit scouts. So what do we say? What is the conversation about mass transit in Middle Tennessee? And this is what I'm really here to talk to you about. I'm going to give you a little history. Michael probably talked about the Mayor's Caucus last month when he was here. And that's where, all the city and county mayors come together and they decided that we're going to do something about transit, and they okay all this other stuff. So a year and a half ago, nearly 2 years ago, the Transit Alliance hired me to conduct a leadership audit. And so we took about 12, 14 city and county mayors across Middle Tennessee and did individual, confidential, one-on-one interviews. Because we wanted to make it confidential because we didn't want Joanne Graves sitting in the room with Carl Dean and the two of them being influencing their other thoughts. We wanted it to stand alone. We kept it confidential. No one's ever seen the actual responses by an individual mayor. And then, so we took those, and then we went out and we started doing county leadership summits. Some of you may have attended one of those. I think we've done 7 of them. Last one we did, I think, was in Robertson County in December. And what we did is we went out and we listened. Now, we talked. Okay, so we talked. But I think we had a good conversation. We talked about, and we're going to get into those a little bit. But I want to share with you, and some of you may have seen this and some of you may have not, but I want to share with you the pieces and parts of what we've done from a communication standpoint related to regional mass transit and starting the conversation. Because there are talking points embedded in this stuff that are the key conversation starters for regional mass transit. So as I said, we conducted the confidential interviews. The purpose was really, what are the real issues? What are the issues in Murfreesboro related to what are the issues in Sumner County related to Davidson County? And then, frank, open discussion. Our result was to identify priorities for the Transit Alliance going forward, which created the need for the county leadership summit. So this is who we interviewed. All those are familiar names to you all. Just from a timing standpoint, kind of picked and choose between city mayors and county mayors, and knew that we had to interview the Nashville mayor, and then we really thought about the hot button kind of places in the region that where transit really is becoming a big issue. And so we started asking them some questions, and I'm not going to share all the questions. Most of these were about an hour-long interview, and so some of them a little shorter than that. But we started asking questions. How do you define regionalism, and why is it important? And there are a lot of transit choices, and so this is going to be really hard to read. So you may want to look on your So when we talk, I'm going to give you just one set example of responses, and so when you're talking about regional mass transit, what do your constituents come back to you with? And so they have a lot of questions about the need and what will it be. How do we get our hands around it from a cost standpoint in our tax base? The tax base in this region is really the number one issue to me that's going forward, because it so greatly is going to affect what happens from a transit standpoint. Does it pay for itself? People never use ask why we need it. I should have put a dash there. People never use it, ask why we need it. Then people who use it are always saying we need more options. Why do we need it? That's, There's the conversation. Why do we need it? You know, that's not a bad question to ask, unless you sit out on 65 or 24 or 40 every day to come into Nashville. Other questions, how do you describe dedicated funding source when you're talking about it? So we ask these questions, and I sit down and I spend a lot of time with these guys, and you know, how do we convince the individual who says, I'll never ride it, to pay for it? Well, we have to first get them to try it and see what it's like. They weren't really listening when I asked the question. When we started the bus service, it was free for the first 2 weeks. People need to try it, realize that it's safe, efficient way to go to work. Word of mouth is the best selling point. So when I asked the question of the mayors, how do you convince somebody who says, I'll never ride it, to pay for it, they immediately want them to go ride it. Well, they're never going to ride it. They may live out the other side of Las Casas or somewhere. They're never going to get on a bus. The truth of the matter is, though, they're going to have to pay for it. We still don't have an answer there. We don't have an answer there because it surrounds the tax base. Okay, so let's see where we are here. Oh, here's another one. There are a lot of transportation choices that may be in the region's future. What's the logical network in the region? Well, the first thing that comes up is rail. Well, I don't know if you guys have had these conversations yet, but you know, rail is just what is it, 3 or 4 times more expensive. The only real solution is going to be a network of BRT lines. That's the real answer here. What Michael showed you, that's what has to be built, because we'll never be able to build light rail, or at least as, I don't know who the youngest person in here is, but let's say that you're in your mid-30s. If you make it to 80, we might have light rail here, but I doubt it. So then we took all that information and I distilled some sort of, we're going to show you some key messages here in a few minutes, but Ed and I sat down and we kind of worked through that. The real thing we got from the leadership was we need help. And so what we said was, well, the best way to get help is to identify those community leaders who, in political leadership, to come into a room and talk about this and educate them. So what you probably saw last month from Michael, we presented that, a very similar, I would think, very similar, I've seen that several times, a similar presentation. We had the RTA come in and talk about what they're doing. And then we talked about advocacy, which is when I started talking about some of the things that I do. And so we really created this transit road show. And I want to share with you some of the things that we shared with them. And this is the facts about where we are in Middle Tennessee today. We're a region of commuters with 55% of the people working outside the home. 33 minutes is the mean time to commute. 28% experience heavy congestion. 27% experience no congestion, and I feel like they must live right off the square in Lebanon and they work on the square and they walk to work. And unless they step over a dog sleeping on the sidewalk, they have no congestion. But I want you to really think about this, that 20 miles is the mean distance to work and 33 minutes is the mean time to commute. How can you not have a conversation about those two topics? How long does it take you to get to work? How do you get to work? We're going to show you that too. Here's our key transportation issues. 42% noted the lack of transit options. They don't have any options but get in their car and drive to Nashville. Or they get in their car in Gallatin and they drive to the Nissan plant or wherever. That's their only option. There is no RTA line that runs from Springfield to Smyrna. No way to get there other than to get in your car or to carpool with somebody. And the carpooling statistics, which I think may be in one of these slides, but the carpooling statistics in this region are laughable. They're laughable. They don't all but don't exist. You know, our issues, too many accidents. Yeah, you know, the problem is that our roads are so jammed that one little fender bender on 440 throws everything into whack every afternoon. How many people commute? How many people work in Nashville, live outside the county? Okay. What time do you leave for work every morning?
About 6 o'clock in the morning.
What time? Okay. How long does it take you?
An hour.
Okay. What time do you leave in the afternoon? Okay, how long does it take you to get home?
About an hour and a half.
Okay. So if you have any kind of accident, where do you live?
Clarksville, Tennessee.
Okay, so if you get on, so if there's an accident on Trinity Lane, you are out of luck. So if on the interstate over there by Trinity Lane, if there's a wreck there, you're out of luck, especially with that construction project. But so think about that. So too much road construction. 17%, and I don't know what's in these people's heads, but 17% said we don't have enough roads. Okay, if you and I got in our car and we drove to Clarksville, tell me where you're going to put the other roads. Show me where you can put more asphalt in this region. I can't understand that. How do you travel normally? Here we go. 90% say they drive alone. Do you drive alone?
Yes.
Okay. In a personal automobile. 8% say they carpool in a personal automobile. 3% bus, 2% walk, 1% said bicycle. They probably live in Hillsborough Village and work at Vanderbilt. Yeah. But look at this. 90% drive alone. And in certain counties it's higher than this. There's some that's 94% drive every day alone in their car. Public transit use. Look at this. You talk about a conversation starter. You have a question, ma'am?
So what's the population or sample group for this?
This was from a 2010, I think it's 500 people were interviewed. Yeah. It was broken down by it's the 10 counties, and there's data on each individual county. And I believe it was 500. Don't hold me to that, but it was definitely in the 300 to 500 range. But 96% people don't use public transit. So there's the challenge in front of us as people who are pro-transit, who believe in public transit, who believe public transit can change the dynamics of our community over the next 25 years. We have to flip, we'll never flip those numbers. We'll never have 96% that say yes, that they use public transit. But we've got to bring that number down. We've got to bring the other one up. We've got to change that. I think it happens slowly. I think we see in Robertson County, their RTA bus. Who's from Robertson County? Anybody today? Your RTA bus service continues to seem to be very successful. Dixon's starting a new service, I guess, this summer. So if you're in Dixon County, I think it's starting as a van service, or no, they are doing the bus service.
Just announced that they're going to start the bus
Okay.
as a result of the summer.
Yeah. So there you go. Right conversation. So anyway, it's incremental and it's starting, but it's got a really long way to go. Funding transportation improvements. This is the crux of the issue. If you sat down with those mayors and you talked about funding, you had one or two who said gas tax, but TDOT won't let us touch the gas tax because that's what they fund all the road work from. Others talked about impact fees. And here's what was amazing to me, that about 2/3 of the counties had emissions testing. And about half of those 2/3 said, well, as soon as we come into compliance with the EPA, we're shutting down the emissions testing. Which I couldn't really understand why, just because you might be in compliance in 2014, what happens if you're not in compliance in 2015? You're starting that all back up again. But emissions fee is a popular one amongst some of the county elected officials. Now, what they'll tell you, though, is how difficult it will be to get that passed in their county commissions. Okay, and so impact fee on private developers. Any private developers in the room? Okay, well, they don't like that at all, as you can imagine. Vehicle emissions test, single occupant cars and carpool lanes. That's, I think in the state of Virginia, going out of D.C., they have those express lanes that you pay and have a little sticker put in your car, and you can zoom down that express lane. But our carpool lanes, there was a story in the paper a few weeks ago about just how people don't pay attention to that law at all. And I'm going to shift a little bit and talk about what your community leaders, and this is you folks. This is what you say are the priorities in Middle Tennessee currently. Education 92% of you put education as the #1 priority, okay? So that makes good sense. Reggie would tell you that education is at the top of everybody's list as it relates to community and economic development. And then job creation is 91%, transit 88%, and then walkable neighborhoods at 79%. But if you bundle those first three things together, that's economic development success, that's growth, that's prosperity. That's what, we're actually prospering in spite of ourselves, to be honest with you, because our transit's awful, but we got great people out there because we live in a great communities, we got great people out there bringing great companies to Middle Tennessee, but we're doing it with a really bad transit. Okay? Here's some attitudes towards transit. Improving or expanding mass transit options. It's difficult to travel without a car. Bus rapid transit's the number second behind buses, because people don't know what BRT is. Can anybody have a conversation about what bus rapid transit is? Do you know? You feel pretty good about being able to talk about it? Good, because it's our future. But at this point in time, buses ended up picking up a few more because that's what people knew. So they probably. When this was done, and this was done in 2008, this is a really kind of a dated survey, I'd never heard of bus rapid transit. So, anyway, now this is Robertson County. I just went in the other day and I said, let's just pull the last one of these that we did. And when we went and did the county summits, we did this in every county. But I think there's a lot happening up there. I think that's a great county. It's still, it's got great opportunities and great potential. And then they also have a pretty good commuter bus service. So 28%, think about this, 28% commute 31 or more miles daily. 24% commute 21 to 31 miles daily. Look at this commute, 46 or more minutes. Now, I understand that you live in Clarksville, you may work here. But think about what could be accomplished if you could get on a rapid bus in Clarksville, be here in 20-something minutes, 25 minutes, and look at how your day is eaten alive. That's California to me, but the truth of the matter, it's Robertson County, Tennessee, that we have to begin to talk about what we're losing because we're not moving forward on a transit system that's regional in scope. 89% drove to work alone in their own car. 37% travel at heavy, unacceptable congestion. 84% say that public transportation is very or somewhat important to the local economy. And 6% support counties partnering to build a rapid transit system. Folks, the conversation is right here. It's right here. It's look at how much time we're spending commuting. Look at how much time we're losing. But look at how important this is to our region. That people say it's vitally important to our success. It's important to our economy. And then we support the counties coming together. You and I drive through Middle Tennessee, and I never think that I've crossed the county line to Cheatham County. Half the time the sign's not even up there. I just kind of crossed the line, and next thing I know, I'm in Williamson County or I'm in Cheatham County, so I don't even think that way anymore. The only people who really think that way are the politicians, or your commissioners. But I think of us as a region, and I may be going to Clarksville or I may go on to Franklin, but all the county lines have disappeared because it's all about the region, really. And we can live and work and play and bring new business into the region. So when you think about the partnership that it's going to take to build this, that's an important conversation to be having. And that's a conversation that you can be having in your cities today. So what do we say? So I'm going to say, from all of this stuff that we've done, here are the messages that we pull together. And it's really about the importance of regionalism. You know, there's some great statistic that I've heard when we were doing this about, you know, Middle Tennessee is the economic driver of this state. It drives the economy of the state of Tennessee. You get a little bit from Dollywood and not much off of Beale Street, and the rest of it is right here. We're moving the economy forward in Middle Tennessee. So regionalism works great here. If you sit in the room with those county mayors, they get along and they get it and they understand what they are willing to partner. And regional mass transit is the only thing that's really going to help us enhance the quality of life in Middle Tennessee. Because the worst thing that we do is sit in a car on an interstate. That's the worst thing we do. Everything else, we got it pretty good, you know. We got great neighborhoods. We got great schools. We've got the Titans and the Predators. We've got the Ryman. We've got it made, you know, from a quality of life standpoint. It's just getting to these places that's what's killing us. So regional mass transit will help us long-term preserve and enhance what we enjoy today. It's important because we have to develop an efficient system that's an alternative to automobiles and cars. Unless somebody's going to create that flying car, we're going to be working on cars, but we've got to have a system that takes some of the burden. Bus rapid transit is an integral component of regional mass transit. It really is it's the answer. You know, what you saw from Michael last month, I mean, if you start to imagine that and you start coming down from Gallatin to Nashville on a BRT system, I think they ought to put BRT. I told the mayor in Clarksville, I said the number one place a BRT ought to go is on Wilma Rudolph Boulevard from the interstate to the Austin Peay campus. Because that's the scariest drive in Middle Tennessee in terms of people pulling out in front of you. It's crazy. But I'm telling you, that would be a winner there. Students could go to the mall. I could come into Clarksville if I wanted to go downtown. I get on a BRT at the interstate. I slide down Wilma Rudolph Boulevard. I'm at the Austin Peay campus, and I can walk downtown. That's imagination. Part of our conversation has to be getting people to get the dream and to see what the opportunities are. Okay, here's the key one. There's no question we have to start talking about what are we willing to pay and where is it going to come from. You know, our economy is so built on property taxes and sales taxes that somewhere something's going to have to give. And I don't know the answer to that, but we have to work together to figure it out. So who do we talk to? And I'm about to finish this up here. Who do we talk to? Well, county influentials who drive opinion. We talk to you. We converse with you. That's one of the reasons you're here. Who are the most important audiences? This is what we ask the county mayors. And again, this is really small. But we talk to business leaders like yourself. We got to talk to local elected leadership. People who vote. You know, our county commission, I won't reveal who said this. Our county commission is mostly rural. They don't have a clue about mass transit. They actually live in a county where in the southern part of the county, there's really not a traffic issue. But as you come in a different direction, all the issues are right there. But they don't see it because they don't do it every day. And the constituents, the people who are using the roads, we have to sell this to the person who leaves home 15 minutes late in the morning and spends a lot of time stuck in traffic to get to work. So if you're stuck in traffic to get to work, you're a constituent that we have to talk to. And we have to show you in a variety of different ways that it can be better, but we have to make a commitment. And we have to have the conversation. The tough conversation about how we're going to fund it. And then we have to keep talking about this in our communities. So what do we say? Well, I always throw this elevator. Every time I do a presentation, everybody talks about elevator pitches, and you kind of go, well, I don't know how to write an elevator pitch, and you know, what's your elevator speech? And so just take this with you. You know, who's your target market? How do you segment that market? If you're in sales, this is, you all know, you know this. Who are the decision makers? what are the needs of the decision makers in the target market, and what's the greatest value we would deliver to the target market? The greatest value we can deliver is we can make an impact on this region for years to come by making some commitments about regional mass transit. So start the conversation. Start asking questions, because if you start asking questions of people, what do they think about that, and then listen to them, then you'll see the barriers that we all have to overcome. We're putting you in, today I'm putting you in, not only will you be a graduate of this program, but you're going to be, you're in the fold. You're in the fold of influencers who can talk about transit in our region and who really are going to be important. If you know the newspaper editor, you need to be talking to that newspaper editor about transit. You're in Rotary, you need to be talking to the Rotary president, program chair about transit. You got to have somebody come in here and talk about that. Michael Skipper's transit presentation is a gee whiz presentation. Have Michael Skipper come and talk to your people in your hometown. Developing allies. I think the key thing is I play this, really making it an issue in the next election. What, you know, if you're going to run for county commission, what are you going to do about transit in our community? What are you going to do about transit in the region? You're going to run for the state senate or state house representatives? What do we need to do about transit in our state? But really, those local elections, start talking about transit and start asking the tough questions about what are you going to do about transit, or what are we going to do together about transit? Because I'll support you if you'll come out as an advocate for regional mass transit. And then be that advocate. Do you get a piece of paper here or a book or something that you've graduated from the program? Is that how you do it? They will. Okay. All right. So you're going to take out of here a sheepskin, okay? So at that point, you're an advocate of transit. So the first thing you need to do is you need to go back home when you've got that and you're a graduate of this academy and you've done the hard work, and I know there's hard work coming because I've heard too much about it. But you've got to go back and you've got to start talking about transit. You've got to start talking about these issues, and you've got to start making it part of the community dialogue. It's as important as education. It's as important as new jobs. So we've got the facts and figures that you can use to back it up. So the conversation just never is. In fact, it begins now with you. And what you need to what you need to know and what you need to take away from here is that it's not going to happen without a grassroots movement of really influential, smart people saying, we got to move forward on transit. We have to move forward on transit. The fact that the RTA doesn't have a regional mass transit plan today needs to change. And if you know somebody on the RTA board, you need to send them a letter that says, where's our regional mass transit plan? When are we going to get a regional mass transit plan? Not, Michael can't do that. Michael is a planner. So the MPO can create the plans, but it takes an authority like the RTA to enact a plan. We have to have a regional mass transit plan. That's what you could advocate for tonight. If you know who's on the RTA board, start talking to them. Start talking to your mayors. Say, we got to have a regional mass transit plan in the next 12 months. So the conversation never ends. It's just beginning. It begins today. Thank you very much. If you have any questions, I'm happy to take them. Hi, Reggie. Yeah, hey, Reggie.
You said 86% of the people favor mass transit.
Yeah.
Has anybody gone a bit further, and what percentage of people would you want to pay for it? And if so, what are those, what's the most effective way? I mean, it seems like we ought to be doing that research.
Well, you know, there's a one slide I could go back and it talks about the fee on developers. There's another one that talks about emissions. That's the only research that I've ever seen, and I don't know that there's anything recently that's been done. You know, I said to Ed one night, we were talking about this, and I said, you know, there is no one single way to pay for it. What's going to have to happen is in each of the individual counties, it's going to be, we're going to dedicate this funding to regional mass transit. And it may be wheel tax in one county. Yes, sir. I don't think there's no one, I don't know if we've talked about this a bunch. I don't, from what I heard from them and what we've heard in the counties, there's no one single, you know, fee. You know, Robertson County has the most expensive driver registration and wheel tax in the region. It's almost over $100, or it is over $100. Is that right? Okay. But see, it's not anywhere close to that in Nashville. It's getting there. But so, see, wheel tax is kind of off the table in Robertson County, but it might be in Wilson County. So I think it's going to end up being it's going to be really hard to do. It's going to be county by county because nobody can come to an agreement about what it is. If you live in Rutherford County, you were in EPA. You were okay with the EPA last year. I don't know about this year. So, you know, you can't do an emissions, tack on the emissions because you may not have emissions testing in 2 years. That's the hardest thing, but yes, ma'am.
So I'll play devil's advocate for just a minute.
I don't usually like the devil, but if you'd like to, please go ahead.
So, like Robertson County, you were talking about their commute times, and that's a predominantly rural area.
Yeah.
So even if mass transit existed, many of those people would have to drive into a centralized location to be able to access that. So did anyone map out where those survey respondents were living to see if, what the reduction in their travel time might be if mass transit was actually enacted there?
The study results that I have did not map out where people lived in the counties.
Like someone that has a 41-minute commute, it might actually take them 15 minutes just to get into town or to get to the interstate.
Right.
To be able to,
Well,
use those corridors.
Yeah, and don't you, in some cases, well, when we talked about, early on in the AMP, there was a lot of conversations about, and I bring this up and I told you I wouldn't, but I will. Sorry. But it's relevant. We talked about, would people drive in from Bellevue, park their car, get on the system, and ride the vehicles downtown? Most of us thought probably not. That once you're in that vehicle, you're probably, especially if you've driven from outer Bellevue, and you think about if you know that geography, you've schlepped your way in Highway 70 or I-40, and you sat there that long, then you probably are going to stay on 40 on into downtown. Now, if you lived out on Highway 70 and you've come in that far, then you might park your car. But I think most of us felt like that once you were in your car and you'd already made a 15-minute drive, you weren't going to park at a park and ride and then come in. You probably were going to stay in that car. Now, I would say to you, if I was facing an hour and I had to drive 15 minutes and I was going to save 40 minutes, 45 minutes, I would make that 15-minute drive and park that car because I'm going to make it up on the back end. But no, to answer your question, no idea about where these folks lived. I don't think it was broken. I never saw any numbers that broke down the demographic that far. Yes, sir.
And I'd just like to say that stress is a lot less if somebody else is under that wheel than you sitting in traffic, just sitting back, leaving and driving to somebody else. I rode the bus yesterday, and I was first complaining about how long it took the bus to get there. And once I got on it, I was having a conversation with the people on the bus, and I said, well, you know what? I would probably be in the same traffic in my car. So it's a lot less stress sitting there, even though I was complaining about the time. But when I was sitting there on that bus, I said, boy, it sure feels a lot better sitting here, not bobbleheading to sleep with somebody else driving. So that takes away a lot of it as well. So even if the commute time doesn't change that dramatically, some of those stressors that come off of that person sitting under that wheel trying to commute is a dramatic difference in itself. You'll be amazed at the health advantages that go with riding public transportation.
More efficient, you can read and work and.
Right. That's right. You got it's a gift of time, and we live in a world now where time is everything. It's incredible the value of 30 minutes to a lot of people on an ongoing basis. So there's an upside there. So,
Okay.
anyway, thank you.
Speaking of time, Greg, thank you again
Sure.
very much. There's an awful lot in what Greg has pointed out, and thank you for putting the outline and the PowerPoint together for us to take with us, because that's very helpful too. I wanted to just, you spent some time with Rob this morning from AARP. He said something, and I just feel like I want to share it now, listening to you and having us here and knowing that Linda's going to be speaking in a moment. Somebody in the conversation this morning at this breakfast said, well, you know, when you talk to a lot of people that are retired or getting older in life, you know, what is it just about Social Security, or is it a lot more? And of course, it's a lot more. He said there are two questions that he hears most, two observations maybe is the way to put it, that he hears most as he travels the country and talks to people about getting older. And I think it's relevant, whatever the station, including being right here in this group right now. Number one, people want to know, did it matter that I was here? Think about that. Did it matter that I was here? And where it is depends on frame of reference. And then secondly, did I leave it better than I found it? And I think that's pretty profound and very realistic if we're honest with ourselves. So I think what Greg has said makes it clear that it very definitely matters that we're here and that we obviously have a challenge and an opportunity to leave it better than we found it. So thank you. Now, I guess, Lydia, are we going to do the fast break? We're good. Get food and drink, and then come on back in, and we'll pick up, and we'll go into the second. Build on what Greg has done and introduce Linda Peakshack to you. Linda is a treasure. I think all of us that have known Linda know that, and it was an instrumental part of the beginning of the Andrews Institute for Civic Leadership here at Lipscomb. In fact, the very first conversations we had with the idea that maybe we would do something like this really involved Linda and the team here at Lipscomb. But tonight, we have a really special thing, because if you read the paper last week, Linda was the recipient of one of the most prestigious awards given to women leaders in Middle Tennessee, the Athena Award. And she won the Athena Award. It's a surprise award. I would love to have been there and seen the look on her face, but we're absolutely honored to have Nashville's reigning Athena Award member speak to us. And then I'll make one other comment about Linda that she will probably push me aside. But in her background, Linda has been associated with the Carter administration of the White House. She heavily was involved in communications with Coca-Cola. And that leads me to the story that I'm going to use to finalize this introduction. Last week I was with our two grandkids in Atlanta, one 10-year-old and one 5-year-old. And among the places that we visited, and I highly recommend it, most of you have been there, I'm sure, is the World of Coca-Cola, right down on the Olympic Centennial Park area, right across from the aquarium, and opposite CNN, and now the new Ferris wheel, the Skyview. Anyway, cool place. So we walk in the World of Coca-Cola, and my 10-year-old grandson, some of you have met him, Owen, is just an incredible guy. We walked, all grandkids are incredible guys. Anyway, we walk in the World of Coca-Cola, and he immediately finds the room that contains all of the Norman Rockwell paintings associated with Coca-Cola. And we had gone together to see the Norman Rockwell display at the exhibit at the Frist here several months back. So he had that on his mind. Anyway, he went from there to all the advertising campaign, all that representation of how Coca-Cola has communicated. And he looked up and he said, "Granddad, these guys really have communicated well over all these years, even back so far as when you were a little boy." So the compliment was they had talented people, and at one point in time when they did some great things, Linda was one of those talented people. So without further ado, Linda Peakshack.
Well, I just changed my entire opening based on what Ed just said, because it's such a great lead-in to what was going to be later in our conversation. The first is that, yes, I was at Coca-Cola. I lived through not only 3 chairmen and CEOs and 4 presidents, but also 3 chief marketing officers. And one of the chief marketing officers was a guy named Sergio Zeman. Anybody heard of him? Okay, you have. All right, well, Sergio Zeman, among other things, lately has written a book called The End of Marketing as We Know It. But when he was at Coca-Cola the first time, he was the person behind New Coke. We'll come back to that. When he came back the second time, one of the things that we engineered was for Fortune to do a cover story on him that said, so you failed, so what? So, because he was back. And he was back doing great things at Coca-Cola. But he had a phrase that those of us who worked with him will never forget and always apply. And that is, everything communicates. Think about it. Everything communicates. And we're going to talk about all the elements of communication, from the way you look, to the person you choose to deliver the message, to the symbols you use, and look at what some people call spin. Now let me give you an example of spin, negative spin, about Sergio. During the period of time that he worked at Coca-Cola the first time, which was in the 1970s, he got the nickname of the Ayatollah because he was so difficult to work with. That actually meant something back then because it was what I call writing the news, right? Because the Ayatollah had just taken over our embassy in Iran, a horrible time in my life, as you can imagine, since I worked with Jimmy Carter. But people at Coca-Cola kind of turned that on its head and used it, Ayatollah, to describe somebody who was very difficult to work with. But he said everything communicates. And I have to say that I'm one of those people who believe that spin is not a 4-letter word. It's not a 4-letter word. In other words, don't think of it as a bad thing to do. Spin is as old as Aristotle. And so today what I want to talk about is, what did Aristotle say you should do to persuade, and why is it that that has lived through the ages, all the way up through Howard Gardner, whom we're going to look at, and we'll close with some of what he says about changing minds, but also a crazy guy named B.J. Fogg out at Stanford University, who has decided to take on Aristotle and tweak it a little bit for mobile communication. B.J. believes we can change the world with mobile phones. So we're going to start with Aristotle. We're going to end with changing the world with mobile phones. And in between, I hope we can build on what Greg has told us about who we need to communicate with and what our facts are and what we should look at for the elevator's pitch. But what I'm going to do is break it down. You know, I'm going to look at what are the things that Aristotle and Howard Gardner and others say are the elements of what? Good persuasion. Because that's what spin is, and that's why it's as old as Aristotle. The advertising world called it influence. And when the White House, particularly Ronald Reagan's White House, began to do it well, it was called spin. I had a student when I was teaching at the Kennedy School who asked me, is there such a thing as good spin? And I drew a chart for him that really goes back to what Aristotle said and what anybody here ever taken the Herman Brain Dominance Index test? Okay, so Aristotle, combined with the way we think based on the way our minds are wired, those two people will give you the best steps in developing a message. So what does Aristotle say first? Aristotle says, number 1, logos. You have to have the facts. You have to have the facts. You have to be able to reason with people based on facts that they accept. The second thing he says is pathos. Pathos is tugging at the heartstrings, the stories, the human faces, the symbols that we use. And finally, he says it's ethos. is the speaker, is the deliverer of the message credible to the audience? Have you matched up the speaker, the person who's delivering your message, with the audience, whether it's one person or 1,000, that you are going to be trying to persuade? Now, one of the most important things in all of that is ethos and choosing the right spokesperson. One of the things that Ronald Reagan did so well was to open people's ears to hear. He was the happy American. He was confident. Believe me, I know this. He defeated the president I worked for, and so I've studied very carefully through the years what David Gergen and others have said about Reagan's communication. I was on the receiving end of it, both when I was in the Senate and in the White House, but after I got out, I wanted to dissect it, and I was privileged enough to work with David Gergen when I was at the Kennedy School, and we were able to really discuss some of the things that he delves into in his book about Reagan being the great communicator. But one thing Reagan did so well was open people's ears to hear. And that's what the right spokesperson with the right message can do. Now let me give you an example of what not to do in this category. The president who preceded Reagan, Jimmy Carter, gave his first speech to the nation on energy. Some of you remember it. And the first sentence out of his mouth, in what we used to call a roadblock, he was on every network that he could be on. You couldn't switch channels and not see Jimmy Carter, right? Roadblock on every channel, and the very first sentence that he uttered was, "Tonight, I would like to have an unpleasant conversation with you." How many people here that at that point people got up, cut off the TV, and decided to go do something else, right? He did not open people's ears to hear. And I think as you think through some of the audiences that you're going to be talking with, you need to first find out, how do I do that? And part of what Greg said about listening and also about researching what matters to them is going to help you with that first utterance to open their ears to hear. So, ethos, logos, pathos, they haven't changed. I think Greg will agree with me. They haven't changed since Aristotle first called them rhetoric. Okay, now, fast forward. The Herman Brain Dominance Index tells us that not just left brain, right brain, which all of you have heard, but that there are 4 quadrants of the brain, and that you need to communicate with people based on what their dominant quadrant is, and you're not always going to have to test to tell you. You're going to have to anticipate that. And also that the best communication, just like with Aristotle that includes all 3, the best communication is going to include all 4 of these. So here's what the HBDI tells us. First, we have to look at the people who care about what is. In HBDI terms, they're called blues, and they care about reason and facts and numbers, and they really won't go anywhere with you in terms of persuading them unless you can start with that. I worked with a lot of CEOs at Coke who were right here. And so when I would go in with some crazy idea about how we should do some PR communication marketing campaign, the first thing that these people want to know is how much is it going to cost? You know, is it in your budget? Because I don't want to have a conversation unless you know how you're going to pay for it. The people over here called yellow, and they're the what if people. Okay, this is what is. I want to know what is, I want to know the facts. The what if people are the visionaries. You know, they're the people who look beyond the horizons. We're going to look at the very end of this session at what John Gardner says leaders do in terms of communication. So we're going to have John Gardner and Howard Gardner at the end. But one of the things leaders do is they're able to see beyond the horizon. John Gardner says they have a sense of renewal, a sense of vision, And most important, they understand the intangibles of motivation, the intangible of motivation when they start trying to communicate with people they want to follow them or with people they're trying to persuade. So this is where we get our vision, our view of the future, the symbols, the stories, the human faces that we need to use in our communication. That's the pathos. You know, if you're looking at what Aristotle said, this is logos and this is the pathos. How do we tug at the heartstrings? But more than that, how do we help them see the future? How do we paint a picture of the future for them? And there's one thing about vision. If you want people to follow you, it has to be three things. One is it has to be aspirational. Okay? It's a stretch for us to get there. It has to be achievable. In other words, don't try to tell me you want me to go there if I don't see a place for me in that vision and how I can achieve it. And it has to be inspirational. The language has to make those folks, once you've said yes, you're a part of it and you can achieve it, and once you've said it's a stretch for us, then how do you inspire them? So it's inspirational, aspirational, and achievable. And that's what I think we need to start thinking about as we take people step by step through the need for mass transit in Middle Tennessee. And there's a reason human faces is at the bottom of this box, because the human faces and the stories and the symbols have to resonate with the who. So if these folks in HBDI are all about the big picture and the vision, these people are all about other people. They're called Reds for a reason, and that is it's all emotion for them. It's all how, and you can imagine, so what would these people say if you bring a project to them in your business and they're thinking only about the human resources side, only about the people? What are they going to say? Who's going to do this? Are you asking me to stretch our folks even more? So they're always going to come at it from the who, but from a vision standpoint and from the human side. So from a communication standpoint, we've got to know who's doing the talking, who's doing the communicating, who are we communicating to, and who do those people care about? Who, back to credibility, who will they listen to? Who are the third parties that are going to affect the way the people in Belmead care about the AMP? Although we'll get to something in the middle where I'm not sure that there was a third party that we could have used there, but who are the third parties? Who are the third parties? Who are the people they listen to? Who are the media that they care about? Do they only listen to Fox News? If they only listen to or watch Fox News, then you know at least a little about where they get their news and the type of information that might persuade them. And finally, there's the how, and I want to talk a minute about the how. These are the people who get things done. I think they're called green for a reason, and that is they need to have everything set out as a process. And they make the world run. You know, the world would not run without the greens, because they're your project managers, they are the people who can actually say, oh, I understand this big yellow vision up here, and I'm going to help Linda break it down into the process that she has no concept how to do. I'm going to help her break that down into how to get it done. So if you think in terms of the person you're talking with, where do they fall on this? And you can figure it out. You don't have to give them the test to find out. You know who cares about facts and figures. You know who cares about, tell me the story. Tell me the vision. Tell me the story. I want to see it holistically given to me. You know about the folks who are going to care about, you know, how is this going to help me and my family as we commute back and forth. And then finally, the greens. You know, how are you actually going to get it done. And this is where the blues and greens are where the funding issue comes in a really impactful way. Okay, so there's something else we can think about when we think about how, because there are a few levers that we control. I actually quit using control in this lecture a while ago. It should say a few levers we can influence. Because in the new world that Greg pointed out to you, there is very little control of a message. But we can at least influence some things. So before we start talking about how words matter, and we go back to symbols and stories and human faces, let's talk a minute about what you can control. You can control, to a certain extent, the venue in which you communicate. Now, this is in-person communication or something for video or audio, where reporters would be coming, or that you're going to put on YouTube. So let me give you an example from way back when, but it's still a good one. Ronald Reagan was known, at least within Washington education circles, for slashing education funds. Yeah, he was known for that. And yet, 60 Minutes decided, okay, we're going to do a story and we're going to tell the world about this. So Leslie Stahl was assigned to do the Reagan education story. And Michael D., who was called the Vicar of Visuals in the Reagan White House. Think about that, the Vicar of Visuals. And he believed, and as you'll soon find out, that the image was everything. The visual, the symbol was everything. And so they do this story. It has all the bad numbers, it has everything, but it also has what Michael Deaver has arranged. And that is for Leslie Stahl to come to a school where Ronald Reagan is sitting down and reading to school children. And so on the morning after 60 Minutes runs, Leslie Stahl gets a call from Michael Deaver. She picks it up and she says, oh, I know, I'm really, I can't say I'm sorry, we just did what we thought we had to do. He said, Leslie, it's okay. Nobody is going to remember your piece, but they're all going to remember Ronald Reagan sitting in that school reading to those school children. Now, there's probably 90% of that is true. We hope some people actually see the substance in stories, right? We don't know if they do. But visuals now, it's called the primacy of visuals. Ever since TV really began, visuals have taken on more and more importance than words. However, words still matter, and that's the second piece of things, the second lever that we have some influence on. And that is the venue, pick the right venue. And one example of this is when we got the check from the Greater Nashville Realtors Association. I got it right, GNAR. When we got the check, Greg and Ed and Hill Hunt decided that we were going to go over on this really dangerous intersection. Tell me where it was.
It was White Ridge Road and I-40.
Yes, right. So they had me out there for the traffic is really bad, right? And we're standing there with this check because the reporters then would talk about how dangerous the intersection was, how much travel, how heavy the traffic was there. And so we gave them a visual. We gave them a venue that matched what we were trying to say. The second thing, as I said, is that words matter. And words matter not just because we've always been a people that told stories, but being precise in choosing words matters, particularly in this debate that we are engaged in right now. So, the quality of the argument, the words that you use, the language you use, the symbols you use, the stories you tell, that's the other thing that you can control. Now, the third thing is really, in my mind, the most important of the levers that we have influence on, and that is the power of the idea. And I think one of the things that we have to struggle with here is that this idea is so amorphous right now. So we have to define the power of this idea in different ways. Now, the power of the idea when we had English only here was articulated in this way by Carl D. He said, we are the only major city to face this test. We're the only major city to face this test, and we have to pass the test. And there was a lot of other argument around that, but that's what people remember. That's what a lot of people remember about English only. Another thing is somebody said here, I can't remember who, said leave the driving to us. Right? That's another, when you start thinking about what are the stories, the ideas that you can build. I realize that the bus trailways or somebody had that.
Greyhound, right?
Yeah, Greyhound, long before us, but hey, you know, I'm sure it's trademarked, but you can use it anyway. But think about what's the language that you use. And in just a minute, we're going to talk about how do you actually put together an argument that includes all those things. Greg has given you a lot of statistics, but you don't want to, you know, most of these people, in fact, the right side, the right brainers, they're going to glaze over if you start using numbers. So you're going to have to use graphs with them. You're going to have to use symbols with them. And I think, frankly, in terms of broader communication, the symbols and the graphs as opposed to the numbers are going to be really, really important. So what else can you control? You can control timing. You can control timing. And we've seen with the AMP, you know, issues of when things were communicated that affected perhaps the acceptance of the message. And so you can control timing. You're going to know in your counties what the best time is to present to certain groups. Now, the other thing you can do with timing is ride the news. Ride the news. So if, in fact, there were a flood or snowstorm that has everybody backed up on I-65, and I drive in from Williamson County, so this is important to me. If you have some event, whether it's a wreck or natural event, that backs up the traffic, I-65, I-24, whatever, and you have a meeting the very next day, or you can schedule a meeting the very next day with somebody who has been in that mess, they're going to be a little more open to what you might have to say. So think about timing and think about, particularly after the mayor has his citizen advisory council in place, that's going to be an opportunity for a lot of you to begin to raise some, to begin some conversations in your area. Okay, the other thing that you can, so we've said the power of the idea, the quality of the language, the level, quality, and credibility of the spokesperson, and the timing and the venue. So those are all things that we have some control over. We also have some control over how we communicate. So you're not going to try to communicate with my 19-year-old niece in any way but what? Text. You know, not email, not phone calls, not cell phone, not home phone, anything, just text. Now, that's not going to be the same with most of the people that we're trying to communicate with unless you're going to use them as third parties. You're going to use them as third parties. And I got to tell you, remember what happened with the environmental movement when they were able to get a curriculum into elementary and high schools. What happened? The kids will come home and say, well, I'm not going to use that much water when I brush my teeth. Or, Mama, we got to recycle. You know, so that whole movement was lifted up by people who began in the first grade to get messages through environmental curriculum that was put in schools. So I hope that we will learn how to use the younger, hipper audiences to actually bring their parents along. There are a few other things that David Gergen, that's live too. There are a few other things that David Gergen said about Reagan in terms of the way that he communicated. And the first I already told you, the open people's eyes to hear. But he also said that he communicated great things. And that goes back to the idea, to the influencing lever that we have. And that is the power of the idea. And as it gets refined more, and I hope in your projects you're beginning to think about what is the idea we're selling? Because you can't just say mass transit in Middle Tennessee. You know, what is the idea? Is it that you can be more efficient and more productive and it's a time saver, we'll give you back your time? You know, what is the power of the idea that we have around mass transit? And it'll be different in each of your counties and cities. There may be some umbrella messages, but that how you phrase it and what piece of it is most powerful for your audience, you'll have to figure out. But he communicated great things, so we have to make sure that the importance of this is underscored. And we have some great language from Mayor Dean from that standpoint. I mean, one of the things that I don't see used, but then I'm already in the choir, right? So I'm not reading a lot of the persuasion. But one thing I think we could use more for certain audiences is that we as a metropolis are successful, and when I say metropolis, I mean the whole region, are successful, and we have peer cities who are equally successful, but who are ready to jump ahead of us because of several things, and one of them being they already have transit. So for a certain group of people, entrepreneurs, business owners, young people who want to be able to move around, for a certain group of people, the idea that we are falling behind even though we're the good city right now may be a powerful piece of the idea. Reagan also used the well-chosen story. So you've got to find what story works for your audience about this and fits into the message that you want to tell. And I know you're not in groups around your county, you're actually in groups for the entire region. So how do you put together a collective story that focuses on regionalism and how important the region is to the engine of economic development? How do you put that together with stories that will resonate from the rural areas to suburbia to the urban areas? And pieces of that will change based on who you're talking to. But what's the story? What's the well-chosen story? The next thing goes to credibility, and that is embodying the message. Again, it goes back to who do you choose to talk with the audience. This one's tough because you have to make sure that the relationship, the quality of the relationship, either one-on-one or with the entire group, is a good one. I took somebody into a meeting last week, and I didn't realize she was going to go in the direction she went. But we were sitting with someone, this goes to doing your homework about who you're talking with, we were sitting and talking to someone who has 2 special needs children. And this consultant wanted to show an idea of how the federal government was putting strings on the local government and how to execute on an education requirement. And so she decided to use special needs children. And she's talking about how, and all the parents come in and their hearts go out to the special needs child and they say, okay, use our money. But then she puts the numbers on the table, right? And it's really interesting because only at the end of the meeting did he say, well, I know what you're talking about because I have 2 special needs children. You know, I go, oh no. And then he said, but you're exactly right. The money that goes to educate my children could be going across the board and serving the school system better. But no, I still don't think we got out of it with our credibility intact. Keep the focus on others, Gergen says that Reagan did. And that's what Greg was saying when he said be sure and listen. And then finally, draw upon communal experience. Now in ours it could be negative communal experience, right? The being backed up on 924 or I-65. But let me give you an example of positive communal experience. When Ronald Reagan, this is another Michael Digger story, you can tell that he was a master. When Ronald Reagan beat Jimmy Carter and was coming in for his first inauguration, Deaver went up to look at where the inaugurations had always been, and they were on a certain side of the Capitol. And he said, well, this is crazy. There's no view here. We're moving the inauguration for the first time in hundreds of years, and over 100 years, to the other side of the Capitol. And why did he do that? Because Ronald Reagan could stand on the steps and look down over the monuments as he talked about Washington and Jefferson. And Deaver could have the TV cameras positioned so that when the president in his inaugural address was talking about Washington and Jefferson and Lincoln, the TV cameras could go to those iconic memorials that Reagan was pointing to down the mall. So we have to, and that was a communal experience because he was talking about the community of America, the things that had built us. So I think we have to figure out what are our communal experiences as Middle Tennesseans, as Nashvillians, as people who are experiencing and enjoying this wonderful renaissance of Middle Tennessee right now. What are the communal experiences that we have? For some leaders, the communal experience of us being smart and having metro government can be something to harken back to. You know, for others, it'll be, look how we came together on English only. You know, but what were the communal experiences that we've had that can help us sell this as we try to move forward together? And finally, Lydia, you can hand out the last thing. It's one of the things I really like to do is tell a couple of stories about words that matter. The first is Frank Luntz, who was Newt Gingrich's friend. Y'all ever heard of him? He's written a book called Words Matter. Okay. Frank's he's Dr. Frank Luntz. He is a pollster and a great message strategist. And he is the person who convinced Newt Gingrich of two things. One is you have to change the estate tax to death tax. And so you have to talk about it. All the Republicans have to talk about it as the death tax. Death is a bad thing. Estates are what rich people have, right? So we don't want, even though most of the people paid for Luntz had estates that were going to actually be affected by the estate tax, that wasn't the point. The Republicans had made a promise to do something about the estate tax. The only way they were going to build support for it was to call it the death tax. The second thing is the contract with America. That was Luntz. And one of the things, you know, the symbol of that was the most important thing about it. How many of you know how much of the contract with America, all of those 10 things, how many of them were actually passed by the Congress that came in, that basically was elected because Newt Gingrich and his cohorts were able to advance that idea? Now, part of one, but mostly none. And so, you know, because they got in, and one of them was term limits. Well, once you get in, you're thinking, I'm not sure I like this term limit idea, right? Okay, well, we're not going to do that. So, but what got them elected and what really transformed the Republicans for a while was the idea, the symbol, we're going to make a contract with you, America. We're going to make a contract with you. Now, let me give you a bad example of language. I worked for some brilliant communicators at Coke and for some that just gave me heartburn every day. I loved a particular CEO. He was a man of the people. He grew up in a rural situation. He put himself through college. He was just a great guy. He had a 10 here. It didn't matter what the audience was. If it was the press, if it was investors, just a 10 here. And it happened over and over and over again. I mean, in one case, he decided he wanted to give a speech where at the end of the speech, there would be wolves howling because he had compared Coca-Cola to being wolves and generic drinks to being sheep and, to being parasites and Pepsi to being sheep. So, you know, and you think you shouldn't give the speech to begin with. I can't kill the speech, but please don't do the wolves at the end. But he did. So what happened? Let's talk about a symbol that was not a good symbol. people from all over the company, all over the world, decided that they were gonna get in good with him by sending him wolf things. And so we had wolf rugs and, you know, wolf bookends, and I would have to go into his office and clear out, you know, a lot of the stuff before reporters would come in because, you know, it wasn't exactly the right symbol we wanted for him anyway. But that's how he set himself up. His last public speech before his last public interview, before the board decided they'd had enough, was, he was in Brazil, he was talking to a technical magazine, and they said, tell us something cool you're doing in technology. And he said, we have the coolest thing. We have a vending machine that as the temperature rises, it raises the price of Coke.
Oh, no.
You get the idea. I have to say, he also once told a European magazine that our biggest competitor in Europe was milk. And I could just see the cartoons, your mother's milk, Coke in the bottle. Yeah. So always, there is a negative side of using the wrong words as well. Okay, look at what I've just given you from Howard Gardner. And Lydia, we're just gonna run through it fast. Gardner pulls everything together, and Howard Gardner has a reputation justifiably of being brilliant. He also has a reputation among some scholars for just taking everything other people have done and repackaging it in a way that people can understand. I happen to think that's not a bad idea, but some scholars have a problem with it. But here's what he says in his book, Changing Minds. He talks about the different ways that you build an argument. And you'll see some of Aristotle in this, and you'll see some of HBDI, and some of Gardner, and some of Ronald Reagan and Bergen. The first thing is reason, a rational approach. And you have to base, when that student asked me, is there such a thing as good spin? I said, yes, it lives right here. You have to start with the facts, and then you build your story. You can't build your story and hope the facts are there. So, reason, or rational approach. Second is research. I think some of you asked some really good questions of Greg about how, you know, what was the sample, how many counties were included. You're going to get those same kind of questions when you start talking to people. And so one of the things we hope we generate out of the academies is where do we need more specific research that can support your arguments. The third is resonance, and you'll see here that he talks about resonance as being affective. It's the right side of the brain. And so you have to, the speaker has to resonate, the stories he or she tells have to resonate, going back to that idea of communal experiences, opening people's ears to hear. The next one's totally unpronounceable. I don't know why I did it. It's representational redescriptions. And all that means is that just like Gardner early in his career said people learn in different ways, well, he's turning that now to persuasion and saying somebody might get it in a graph better, some people might get it in words better, some people might need to see a visual, but you need to figure out how you can use all those things. And when Kathy puts you in your groups, I have suggested that you at least take a minute and look on the iPads in the Institute space at how Metropolitan Revolution, the writers, anybody here know that book? It's a new book, the mayor, I understand, has his staff reading it, called Metropolitan Revolution, written by folks at Brookings. Bruce Katz is one of the authors. But we have downloaded on our iPads their brief case studies of cities that they've done. You can actually go through it in about 3 minutes. It has the key points, it has the statistics, it has the graphs, it has a video telling a story, and it's all downloadable and understandable in only a few minutes. If you don't have time to do it today, I would just suggest that, okay, there's no time to do it today. I am told there's no time to do it today. But if you have an iPad, it is a free download, Metropolitan Revolution. I strongly recommend it to learn how to communicate these kinds of issues. Resources and rewards. B.J. Fard argues that you can't make somebody do something that they don't have the ability to do. And so the carrot and stick is really not that useful in a period of time where motivation really comes from giving people a sense of purpose, helping them do something better, and giving them the autonomy to do it. So carrots and sticks are something that he actually puts at the low end of the list, and now I think even more are that you just can't make somebody change their attitude and behavior and have it stick. Real world events, we talked about that, writing the news. What can we do? And the best story I have on this is the Soviet Union was coming apart, which is kind of interesting right now because I think it's coming back together. But the Soviet Union was coming apart, and the Bush 1 White House couldn't decide whether or not to recognize the Latvia and Lithuania and what were called the Baltic states, right? Couldn't decide whether or not to recognize them. So Cope was wanting to figure out a way to look really nimble and flexible, and my charge had been to try to figure out ways to do that. So I went up to the CEO and the president. I said, do you want to have some fun? Let's recognize the Baltic states. So, and this is writing the news, right? I'm seeing this, I'm thinking, we can look really nimble. And I thought they'd tell me I was crazy, but they said yes. And I said, well, there is one catch. I have got to call Marlon Fitzwater at the White House and tell him that we're about to do this, so that he's not surprised in the morning when we get what I believe the league will be, which is the Bush can't decide whether or not to recognize the Baltic states, but Coca-Cola has. And sure enough, the next day, USA Today had the headline, Coke recognizes the Baltics. So, was that fun? Yeah. Did it kind of move us toward our goal? Yes, it did. But it was also writing the news. So, real world events. Context. I think context is so important right now in the AMP and in some of the other issues that you'll be looking at. And finally, resistances. And if you get to the point where you got to worry about resistances, basically Gardner says it better be a really good idea. You better have the facts, you better have the stories, you better have the power of the idea, because if you have strong resistance and you don't have those other things, you won't be successful. And I think we can all learn a lot by identifying what are the resistances in Middle Tennessee to mass transit. And with that, I will suggest that you look at I mentioned John Gardner earlier. I just gave you the page from his book on leadership that addresses how leaders think. And I really do think we're going to have to position this as a leadership issue. It's a leadership issue, and it's a how do we help people save time? How do we help the environment? How do we point out that it's healthy? And how do we get all of those messages out to the people who care about those things? Thank you very much.
Questions? We have Kathy.
Question.
Yes.
More of an observation maybe. And I noticed maybe you're somewhat partisan, but that's okay. Would you characterize progression in our society since you worked in the White House as the dumbing down of America advancing?
Yes.
Things like MTV became, or the
Yes.
music industry overtook.
Well, and think about
Image was-
that's right. Image was everything. Visuals are everything. Now, 140 characters is everything. I mean, how much can you get into a tweet? And so the real question for us, I think, is how do you communicate with people where they are? The man on the street interviews that all the different comedians do, just proves to us nothing new. It's just that you got to educate people. So part of what we have to do first is inform. And then ask that question that posters ask. If you knew that, would you vote for? And so we have to use the questions and our communication with them to inform before we ever ask them for something. But yes, it's dumbed down. And by the way, I have voted for Republicans and I have voted for Democrats. And I admire the Republicans that I mentioned.
What would you say then, from the early 1980s up through now, our hill is steeper to climb in order to overcome those things that you mentioned?
Yes, and Carter was the last unspun president. And so while I don't think spin is a four-letter word, I think it's made it harder to get to the facts and find out how can we make decisions. Howard Gardner, just one thing. I didn't do this tonight, I didn't have time, but Howard Gardner has 5 minds. I'm not gonna do all 5 of them, but one of his minds is the synthesizing mind. He says there are 5 minds we need for the future, and one of them is the synthesizing mind. And what he says is it's more important than ever for us to curate the information for our own lives. You know, we have to decide, what are we gonna read, what are we gonna view, who are we gonna trust, and why. He urges people to think through, who am I trusting and why? What am I reading and trusting and why? And what am I rejecting and why? Because you become a curator of your own life. And what I make my students do is, if they are liberals, and I taught at Emerson College, which is the most liberal college in America, so with my liberal students, I made them take the conservative side. They had to figure out what were conservatives reading, what were their arguments, and then they had to take the conservative side in a debate. And here, obviously, I have gone from one of the most liberal to one of the most conservative schools in the country, and I make the conservative students take the liberal side, because in the end, I think nobody is well informed unless, if for no other reason, so you know what the other side's arguments are, you are watching and reading both sides. But people aren't now, and that's part of the, I don't want to call it dumbing down, but it's a lack of information, uninformed. If you believe that this program was developed because we believe engaged, informed citizens can help bring around change, then it's the engagement and the informed part that I think are missing more and more.
Okay, speaking of informal.
That's
great.
Yeah,
Thank you, Linda.
I've got the really easy job of dismissing you into groups to work on your projects for the next official, 13 minutes. Did you have a question, Carrie? No, you were making motions back there. Before we do that, any questions about the group projects? I know there were some questions last time when I missed, and I think all of those got answered, but we'll be glad to answer more.
So who is our audience, or do we pick our audience?
Well, I think that's a great question. I mean, obviously, your audience the night of May 7th or is that the right date? Whatever the last date is this group. But then beyond that, that audience could change. So I think you're going to have to probably develop a project around what that audience might look like. So it could be that you're going to the Williamson County Rotary or Nashville Rotary, or it could be that you're in Dixon County presenting to county commission there, or whatever. So it's it might change a little bit, and you have to tweak to make it.
And just to add on to Kathy, we may have a few guests on the final night. We'll let you know if there's some
Oh,
guests
yeah.
coming in. I'll email you if there's people other than themselves.
Yeah.
But we tend to like to bring a few folks on the final night because it is a big night.
And
But the point is a good one, that if you know who your audience is,
yeah.
you're gonna develop that message.
Right. Exactly. So yeah. So you're.
Well, I'm saying choose an audience.
Choose an audience, right.
Don't worry about who's there.
Yeah.
Choose an audience and say, this is what.
Yeah.
Yeah, and I think just, it's been in the past real powerful to say, we're assuming tonight we're speaking to. And then go from there, and then we all adapt to that.
Yeah. So we've got